two of the biggest myths that the average person probably hears is that the US has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of people that are actually locked up in prison. And the second one is that if you were to just get rid of people in prison in the US that are first-time drug possession offenders, the whole war on drugs, we would pretty much empty out the prisons. And from reading your paper, these are not true. But would you want to explain these two common myths to start this podcast out?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for having me. I'd say the most important myth is really about who goes to prison, because there is this popular idea that prison is just filled with, first-time pot smokers or people who made a easily understandable mistake. When you actually look at who goes to prison, about 62% of them are for violent offenses, so definitely not drug offenses. And of the remaining, about 32% are recidivists, meaning they've already been through the justice system, committed a crime, are repeating their nonviolent crimes. And drug offenses are an extremely small percentage. You only have 17% of the prison population incarcerated for any drug offense, but only 3% of the prison population is for drug possession. The rest are for drug manufacturing, trafficking. And another thing is that plea bargaining also means that these drug traffickers may have committed other crimes like assault or robbery, and they just took a plea for the drug charge, which often has actually a less sentence. So even the 17% number is probably overstating the share of pure drug offenders in the system. And that completely blows most people away and before I started researching it, I also had this idea that, maybe 50% of the prison population are just drug offenders. And that's just not true at all when you look at the data. So that's the first myth that you talked about, I think. But the other one was the international comparison, right, that's often made. And on that front, it's a little more complicated because it's definitely true that the US has a larger per capita prison population than a lot of other countries. But that sort of comparison misses a lot of important differences, both in terms of crime rate across countries and also criminal justice system effectiveness. For example, we incarcerate more people on average per capita than Mexico, but it's not because we're more punitive. It's just because the Mexican justice system is really bad at catching crime. So other countries' lower prison populations often show that they need to increase their incarceration rates, not necessarily the U.S. decrease its incarceration rate.
It's called mass incarceration. So automatically it predisposes you to think there's just too many people locked up. But since 2009, basically the prison population peaked in 2009. And since then, and we're in 2025 right now, it's actually reduced by 25%, which is a quarter of the population. And then also going back to the first question, you'll hear this number. I was on Grok today. It's how many people are in the U.S. prison population? I've seen as high as 10 million people. And it's it's not even it's not true, but even the prison system itself reports 1.2 million people locked up. How do we get from 10 million to 1.2 million? How are those stats actually calculated? And how is it that we have a 25% reduction in our prison population since 2009, yet no one even knows this?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to start by thinking about what happened to the prison population over time. So in 1960, there were about 200,000 prisoners in America and an incarceration rate of 117 per 100,000. And that increased to a peak of 1.6 million prisoners in 2009, with an incarceration rate of around 504 per 100,000. Now that's fallen to around 1.2, maybe 1.3 million prisoners today, and an incarceration rate of around 350. So we are about 200% larger than 1960, but we're actually 30% lower on a per capita basis than 2009. So there has been this dramatic fall. And I think the reason why we often don't hear about that is the sort of decarceration activists want to keep this as an urgent problem. So they're not going to publicize that there's been this decline over the last 15 years. And they also play games with the numbers sometimes. So we were just talking about prisoners, but they'll also add in people who are in jail, who often are pretrial detainees or people serving extremely short sentences. That would add in another about 500,000 people. And then sometimes they'll also include probationers or sometimes they'll just throw in everybody who's ever been to prison at any point in their life. And that's how you might get to extreme numbers, like 10 million and so forth. But all of those games are played to really make the size of incarceration seem larger. And they don't need to do that if they're going to push prison reform. I, for example, am not like extremely pro-prison. I'm happy to have a prison reform conversation, but I think we need to have it on the basis of actual facts and not sort of a falsely inflated size of the problem.
But when I was looking at some of those numbers of the 5 million or 10 million, which I see pretty routinely, of 5 million people are in the prison system or 10 million people are in the prison system, the key word is system, because that's basically saying they're not actually locked up. And something around like 2/3 of people in the quote unquote prison system are actually on probation or parole. So you're not actually behind bars. So to equate someone that's on probation, where maybe a parole officer checks on them, a couple times a month, is vastly different than actually being behind bars. I guess it's just like the whole, like, you can lie with stats. What does Mark Twain say? There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. I mean, you can kind of use them anyway, but the fact is, if you're on parole, you're not in prison. I mean, you're comparing apples to oranges.
Yeah, absolutely. And having researched the system, I will say a lot of the scholarship does play these games, where it's just using statistics to support whatever predetermined point you want to make. And that is a big problem. Another big problem is also, for some of the more sort of specific questions about what's causing the incarceration rate increase or decrease, there's often not a lot of good data because the government doesn't collect the data we might want, or it collects it and it doesn't release it. There are all sorts of data problems in the field of criminal justice studies.
One of the other big themes of this article that we're talking about, this paper, The Mass Incarceration Myths and Facts, you talk about the clearance rate. So for people that don't know, just kind of the simple version of the clearance rate is just cases where like an arrest has been made or the case has been cleared, so to speak, from the actual police working on it. And that doesn't include the conviction rate. But you basically say that in 2023, the clearance rate for murder, which is actually the highest rate of any of the crimes, is 47.5%. And to compare that to, say, 2003, it was 62%. You want to go to aggravated assault. In 2023, it's basically 43%. Is 12%, robberies 25%, burglaries 12%, motor vehicle theft is about 7%, arson 22%, and shoplifting 35%, embezzlement is 25%. These are just the numbers of the cases that are cleared. The conviction rate is, way less than that. I mean, the conviction rate of murder is what, like 70%?
It's about only 60% of cleared cases lead to a conviction. So you're really only looking at about 1/3 of murderers actually getting convicted for homicide.
Right. So if you murder someone, basically, let's just simplify this. If you murder someone, there's about a 1 in 3 chance that you actually go to prison over this. Something like rape is like somewhere around 4%. The gist of the article is that actually not enough people are in prison because the clearance rates and the people that get away with it is so high. To think if 70% of people get away with murder, that's absolutely insane. And that has the highest rate of people actually being caught.
Yeah, I would say it's the single biggest problem in the criminal justice system today, and it's stunning, the absolute lack of silence and lack of attention it receives from researchers, the media, politicians. You're looking at a catastrophe of unpunished crime, and that has very real effects in communities. Like, high crime communities are high crime communities because the justice system does not catch these serious offenders and punishes them. I mean, the thing to understand is most crime is repeat crime. Like, when you do studies of the average prisoner in prison, they've committed 12 or more non-drug crimes in the year before their incarceration. They're getting punished for a tiny fraction of the crimes they're committing. And as you pointed out, if you're committing a serious crime like rape, robbery, assault, all these things like 5% or less, the chance that you actually get punished by a sentence in prison. So we do need to raise punishment rates. And that actually wouldn't even raise incarceration rates as much as people think, because there's a natural fact that about 20% of the offenders commit about 80% of the violent crimes. So if you just successfully incarcerate those most prolific serious offenders, you're going to massively reduce the crime rate without actually adding all that many extra bodies to prison.
One of the things that people always kind of talk about is the whole war on crime, all these extra policies where they were doing the 3 strikes and whatnot. And when the prison population kind of ballooned. But one that never is talked about is the fact that, people were committing crimes, so people were being caught. But also, when you look at like the 1960s and 70s, there's a lot of crimes today that weren't actually crimes back in the day. Right now, like if anyone's ever worked in law enforcement, especially if you're working second or third shift, most of your shift is spent on DVs or domestic violence, which wasn't even a crime to think like in the 60s and 70s. But like to think like there's a lot of crimes that we have now that weren't even crimes 40 years ago. And like in the prison population, to think like, what would it have been then if they would have had a lot of these crimes, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at the expanded level of criminalization we have, which I think is in many ways a good thing. If, we're taking sexual assault more seriously, we're taking domestic violence more seriously, we're taking child pornography more seriously. But if we had taken that as seriously as we do now in the 1960s, absolutely, you would have a significantly higher prison population. There's no question about that. And there's also a fact which isn't talked about a lot, because often you hear we're at historically low rates of violent crime, or historically low rates of crime, but we're still significantly higher rates of crime than in 1960. The violent crime rate today is more than double what it was in 1960. So one reason why we have more people in prison is just there's more crime occurring. And that's a natural consequence. You actually don't want us to have less incarceration than 1960 if the crime rate's way higher, because that means more criminals would simply be escaping justice.
Why are more people committing crimes now than they were in the 1960s?
That's a hard question. The sort of criminological dynamics of what caused the great crime wave in the 1960s to the 1990s and what still explains its elevated rate. But lots of researchers have tried different explanations. There's the pure demographic explanation, which is there was basically a surge of young people in the 1960s, which, since young people commit more crimes, it was harder to socialize all these young people. That led to a glut of criminals. There are popular like social norm explanations that really you're seeing subcultures of violence, especially in a lot of urban communities, and that's what's causing it. There's the drug explanation that now a lot of criminals are also addicts, and that's driving the criminality and making rehabilitation more difficult. There isn't any one precise answer. I would say that in some ways asking what's causing the crime at the individual level is absolving the system of responsibility, because what's causing the crime rates at the societal level is really because the justice system isn't stepping in and preventing the crime. If the clearance rates were significantly higher, the conviction rates were significantly higher, you would just have much less crime. Right now, we're operating under a system where there's very little deterrence. Studies have shown that the average offender doesn't really feel deterred until they perceive a 30% chance of being caught for their crime. And as you just pointed out, for no crime except maybe murder, are you even getting close to a 30% chance of being caught? And similarly, all this crime is mainly repeat crime, so your failure to incapacitate offenders also explains why there's just a lot of crime that's going on in society. So I'd say the most effective way to bring down crime is really to focus on improving the justice system's effectiveness, focus on punishing that serious crime that's going unpunished, and then you're going to bring crime rates down without even addressing any of the other root causes.
One of the things that I find to be fascinating is that we talked about these clearance rates, about how they're basically much lower than they were in 2003, over 20 years ago. And we've all seen shows like CSI. How is it that you can commit murder in 2023 and have a higher chance of getting away with it than in 2003 or in 1993 or 1983? I mean, that's insanity to me. I thought the technology is supposed to, I thought we're in the Minority Report era, right? Like you already have a thought crime. Like how are you getting away with it? How are you getting away with it, Jeffrey?
Yeah, it's crazy, because definitely when you watch crime TV, you're like, the detective always finds out the criminal, and we have all these high-tech things. Why aren't we solving the crimes? In some ways, it's a policy choice. We could be solving the crimes. You go to Japan today, the homicide clearance rate is 95%. So they are indeed solving pretty much all the crimes. You even go to specific localities in the United States, and they're solving 95% of their homicides. So it is definitely possible. It's mainly a lack of resources and investment in these high crime localities. There's just simply not the political will or the resources there to solve these crimes. What you need to do in a lot of these cases is invest in the infrastructure, more detectives, more CCTV cameras, because one reason why a lot of murders go unsolved is their street shootings, which are very hard. There is no like DNA being left that you can run. There is no blood sample from the offender. It's just somebody gets shot on the street. All you have is the dead body and the bullet. However, in other countries which have much more extensive public CCTV camera networks, you can actually track down who did something like that. But we just don't necessarily have the resources invested in the criminal justice system infrastructure you need to have the clearance rates as high as we'd like them. And there's also the problem that the most sort of rich and powerful and politically connected people, they live in very safe communities. Like crime is not a problem for them. Unpunished crime is not a problem for them. This problem is highly concentrated among poor and minority communities. And that, I think, helps explain why it doesn't receive quite as much attention as it would if, say, the gated communities had a bunch of murders that were going unsolved.
I've read numerous of your papers, but one of the big themes is that everyone will always kind of use the comparison to Europe or other countries, be like, oh, well, we have this big incarceration rate in the US, and you're kind of just as like, well, maybe they're just doing it wrong. Maybe more people should be locked up. And then you show these studies in like Europe where, the vast majority of people are actually kind of like dissatisfied, where they think that the criminals should be doing more time. Like it's too lenient. Just because another country has less people locked up doesn't necessarily mean that they're somehow doing things better. I lived in Australia I did a work and holiday visa in Australia for a year. The murder rate there is really low, but I saw a fist fight literally every single day. Like you'd walk down the street, you might just get the shit kicked out of you. I'm like, so yeah, at least you're not getting murdered, but like, do you want to just get physically assaulted? Because that's just like standard there. I think like the comparisons are kind of, and who knows how even accurate the data is. Like they say China, like, are you going to trust the data from China? How many people are locked up in China? I don't know. I'm certainly not believing the figures that are coming out of that country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say international comparisons are really tricky. It's very popular in the literature to make these headline comparisons of, oh, look how much more people we incarcerate than, say, France or the UK. Clearly, we're wildly unjustly punitive. And nobody asks, okay, but what are the actual punishments in those countries? Who's going to prison? Are enough people going to prison? And an interesting, like a 2015 poll found that 86% of the European Union's public thought that there should be harsher punishments for crime. You have deep, chronic dissatisfaction with how lenient the justice systems are in Europe. And when you look at the time served for crimes in Europe, you can see why. Like you're looking at homicide being punished with 5 years in a lot of cases. You're looking at rape being punished with maybe 1 or 2 years if you go to prison. Often you have these horrifying cases where you have a rape or a severe assault and you just go straight to probation. Like there was a case, I think, in Germany. It was again with like 9 offenders, and none of them served any time in prison. So if you have a system that's going to be that lenient, and the public doesn't want that system, I'd say the problem is on those European countries, not really on the US. We have to ask, how should we determine what an appropriate level of punishment is? And I would say we look at the community. The community ultimately decides what they consider a just, satisfactory punishment is for the crimes that have been committed. And we're closer to achieving that in the US than the people are, I'd say, in Europe.
The median time served by all prisoners in 1960 was 21 months. In 2018, which is the last years we have good data for, was 15.6 months, which is a 25% decrease. Because we always hear, people are basically like, you jaywalk and you get 30 years in prison, or you smoke a joint walking down the street and you get 800 life sentences or whatever. It's not true. I mean, the fact is, like, it was, we're way more lenient now than we were in the 1960s when a lot of these activists want to go back to. So, I mean, how long does the average person spend in jail? How long does the average person spend in prison? And what's kind of the difference between these two?
It's really interesting because I'd say this is so commonly believed that we're much more punitive than 1960. There's been this huge scale up in punishments. And for very few crimes, like murder, there has been a significant increase in the time served in prison. The same thing goes for rape. But if you look at 1960, it was a 28 months. That was the mean time served in prison. So that counts for all those extreme sentences for things like murder. Today, it's 32 months. So very similar. And as the median, as you suggested, it was 21 months in 1960, only 15.6 today, actually a reduction. And it's very interesting. If you look at the specific crimes, yes, their time served has increased. You're punished significantly more than you would be in 1960. For example, today, I think the punishment for murder is about 17 years. In 1960, it would have been closer to 10 years. Today, the punishment for rape, if you actually get convicted, is closer to 7 years. Back in 1960, it would have been 2-point-something years. But for all these other crimes that you look at, there has been no change in the amount of punishment, or there's been a reduction in the punishment, whether we're talking drug crimes, assault, burglary. So when you look at that, you realize, okay, the system really isn't being much more punitive, except for a couple crimes where I think everyone in society can agree, yes, it's better if we punish rape a bit more harshly than we did in 1960. It's better if we punish murder a bit more harshly than maybe 10 years. So I don't think most people in the public would find the increases in sentencing that's happened since 1960 as objectionable, and they'd be surprised at how little that increase has actually been.
One of the other big themes of your pieces of work was basically like a lot of these sentences should actually be congruent with what society wants, and that there's a lot of sentences that maybe are too short, or there's sentences that are too harsh. So kind of taking this question in two parts, what are sentences you think in the US that are too harsh for the crime, and what are too kind of lenient for the crime based on what the community, the whole US thinks is actually adequate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I would start off by saying I think we need the system to really focus on meeting that community demand for justice, because right now sentencing policy is often determined by elites who don't care if they are passing a just sentence in the eyes of the community. And that is reflected on both ends, with too much harshness or too much lenience. On the harsh end, I'd say you really get to see that with certain mandatory minimum and repeat offender laws. It's not so much the punishment for any crime in the statutes. It's more that, for example, a 3 strikes law that just automatically states a third felony is going to lead to 25 years to life under, for example, California's old 3 strike statute. That was clearly out of line with public opinion, because while many third-time offenders would deserve that, there were plenty whose third-time offense was really, not very severe. There was a famous case of a guy who stole a slice of pizza, and he was, given 25 years to life. That would be an example of a far too harsh sentence in the eyes of the community, and you need some flexibility when you're sentencing repeat offenders to make sure those injustices aren't happening. But I'd say lenience is actually the bigger problem today, because and we don't have any good research on this. And it's something I'm hoping to do in the future. And it's really a shame that nobody in academia has done this for the last 30 years. We don't know what the average American thinks the appropriate punishment in terms of years in prison is for murder, robbery. But the last sort of study that attempted to measure that was in the 1990s. It was done by the U.S. Sentencing Commission. And it found for every single crime they looked at, people demanded harsher punishments than what the system was actually giving. So I think that most people would probably say, is the current punishment for forcible acceptable if it's like maybe 7 years? I think a lot of people, particularly a lot of women, might want a bit of a harsher punishment for that. And I'd say for like a robbery where maybe you've also assaulted your victim, you've given them lifelong trauma. Often, if you're getting punished with like 3 years, is that really, especially if it's because most of these are not first-time offenses. Maybe I could understand if it was a first-time offense, but if this is like your 3rd or 4th offense, is 3 years appropriate for something like that? Again, I don't think I'd really say that it is. And one thing that we do need to keep in mind is that the current criminal today has a much longer record. They've had many more chances than the average criminal in the past. And that was something which I had really not thought about before conducting this research. We don't have great data from the 1960s. We really only start to get good data around 1990. But even in 1990, if you look at the average felony defendant, it was 64% had no prior felony, and only 1% had 10 or more felony convictions. And when you go to 2009, you actually have only 40% now have no prior felony conviction, and a stunning 14% have 10 or more felony convictions. So the average criminal today has had a lot more chances in the past, and the system is simply clearly failing to punish them adequately or deter them in the future. And I think that also needs to play a role in when we're talking about sentencing policy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because basically everyone's like, oh, yeah, everyone deserves a second chance. But you're not talking about people deserving a second chance or a third chance or a fourth chance. They're like 18 chances. I mean, at some point, maybe you don't deserve another
Absolutely.
chance without at least some form of repercussion.
Yeah. I would say that is one of the great myths, and it makes for great anecdotal stories about this is a first-time offender, he made a mistake, the system is punishing him too harsh. And can you find individual instances of that in America? Of course you can. Like, there are millions of crimes, millions of arrests. You're going to find cases like that. But it's absolutely true that the typical person in prison or even in jail has had numerous chances to leave the system behind and to be rehabilitated. They were probably given probation multiple times. They've gone through the entire juvenile justice system, which is very lenient. That's another thing that's not talked about. There was a real move toward lenience from the 1960s onward in the juvenile justice system, where basically juvenile offenders understand there are going to be no consequences for what they do before the age of 18, unless it's really serious, like something like murder. They can basically do whatever they want. Those records will be sealed. It will not affect them. And as a result, what you're really seeing is people who have had, 5 chances, 10 chances, even 15 chances, and they just keep committing crimes, keep getting arrested. And they're only being punished for a tiny fraction of what they've actually, the harm they've done to society and to individuals.
In preparation for this podcast, I was talking with one of my friends who's been a police officer since 1983 in the state of Colorado. And I was like, how many drug offenders just like walking down the street smoking pot have you arrested? And he's like, I've never arrested a single person in my entire career for walking down the street smoking a joint. And he's like, so then I was like, do you think that the rules are tilted more towards the criminals or more towards the prosecution? He's like, everything favors the criminals. And then, we're kind of talking about like use of force and all this stuff. And he's like, I would rather get my ass beat and not have to do a report. Cause he's like, if you use any use of force, even a little bit, you're going to have some civilian board, which doesn't, of course, this is Colorado where it's a little bit more, quote unquote progressive. But he's like, you're going to have some civilian board that has no idea what your job is like. They're going to throw the book at you. So he's like, I'd rather just get my ass beat, not do anything, and not have to deal with the fallout versus like actually like quote unquote doing my job. But I'm like, isn't it pretty sad that you'd rather get your ass beat than have to go through the civilian board and all this stuff? And he's like, yeah, but I'd rather do that than go to jail. It seems to me pure insanity.
Yeah, it is. And if you want to talk about false narratives, like police use of force is a classic example of that, because if you ask the average American, they think thousands upon thousands of unarmed black men are being killed each year by the police. In reality, only about 1,000 people total are killed by the police. About 25% of those are black, and 94% are armed. So you're really only looking at 6% of police killings being potentially suspect, I'd say. And even if you're unarmed, you can still be posing a dangerous threat. So you're really only looking at a handful of cases each year where you might have any sort of George Floyd type situation occurring. And most of the public just has no clue about that. It's stunning. Like, you ask educated college students, law students, professors, and they're going to be citing these insane numbers to you that they think the police are killing. And that's just not true at all.
As we alluded to a little bit earlier, talking about reform, like, just because you're talking about this stuff doesn't mean that you don't necessarily think the prison system, criminal justice system doesn't need reform. One of the issues that I see with the criminal justice system in America is that there's just so many layers, right? You have 50 states, so you essentially have 50 different criminal justice systems, plus you, of course, have the federal government on top of it. Of course, you have Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands. There's other territories that are part of it as well. But basically, let's just start at kind of, you have law enforcement, you have the courts, you have the judges, you have the juries, you have the legislators who create regulations, you have activists. If you're a police officer, are you a statey, or are you a sheriff, or are you working for a city, aka a municipality, which all have different things? If you're a police officer and you want to move states, then you have to get recertified because that state has different rules. So I guess it's kind of like a fairly like decentralized network, so to speak. But where would you say are actually the areas that we could make some of these changes and have the most impact?
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of separate problems of how do you make the criminal justice system more effective, which I'm very invested in. And then there's also this problem of how do you make the prison system particularly more effective, also more rehabilitative and more cost effective. And on that incarceration point specifically, I am totally with the people who say, look, prison is doing a poor job because admittedly, recidivism rates are extremely high. You have like 70% of prisoners being rearrested within 5 years of release. You're not doing a good job of rehabilitating people in prison. If there was a way, and prison is also extremely expensive. It's $40,000 a year on average to incarcerate someone. And in California, that's as high as $100,000 a year. So if you could find a cheaper, more rehabilitative way to safely and justly punish criminals for their crimes, I would be all on board with that. And I'd say pretty much all Americans, left or right, would be on board with that. And finding non-incarcerative punishments is actually quite easy. If you look around the world, you look at the available technology, when you study, what do people find actually punishing about a situation? Well, they find the removal of liberty punishing. They find the imposition of requirements of what you have to do, like work requirements punishing. So you can create a pretty tough non-incarcerative sentence where you say, look, you're basically under house arrest, except maybe between these hours, you have to have a work requirement here. You have to go attend like a training or a treatment session here. And we're going to dictate every sort of hour of your life, just like we would if you were in prison. And we're enforcing all of this with, let's say, electronic monitoring and a body camera. You do something like that, you've created an electronic prison sentence. And it's true, it's not as punitive as a regular prison sentence, but then all you need to do is simply expand the amount of time you're in electronic prison. Because eventually you're going to get equivalents where, let's say, a 1-year physical prison sentence is the same punitiveness as a 2 or 3 year electronic prison sentence. And at that point, you have a just decarceration solution, which is also safe if you have the appropriate safeguards. And that's how you can move a lot of people out of prison with non-incarcerative punishments. And I'd be on board with that because that would save money. There's evidence that would improve rehabilitation, and it would not really decrease I'd say, deterrence or incapacitation. If anything, it might actually increase deterrence because you're being really closely monitored for longer periods of time. It's going to be harder to commit crimes during that period. So I'm all on board with those sort of common sense decarceration measures.
What percentage of right now in the U.S. prison system could you actually do this kind of remote incarceration? I mean, if you're like a murderer or some of these more, serious crimes, do you think they should also have access to this remote, prison? How many people could we actually get out of the system?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say certainly starting out, you wouldn't even touch the most dangerous offenders, people like murderers, rapists. And to be honest, I think there is probably a cutoff. At some point, a just punishment is 25, 30, 40 years in prison. You really can't, have an equivalent sentence in the community. So let's just leave the murderers out. Let's just leave the rapists out. But if we're just going to focus on the nonviolent recidivists, and we're going to focus on some of the felony assaulters and the felony robbers, you still have a significant share of the prison population. We ran the numbers in one of our studies, and you could potentially be looking at 66% of the prison population who you could apply these electronic measures to. And you wouldn't start out doing that. Obviously, you'd do a small sort of pilot program. You'd put out the least dangerous offenders first into the community with these electronic prison sentences. And only you'd monitor the recidivism rate. And only if that was a success would you even think about expanding it to some of the people who are in there for violent offenses like assault or robbery. But it's definitely something that you can do. We need to experiment more with it. We need to test it and validate it. But there's very encouraging evidence that exists that this is a possible decarceration alternative to prison that can work. But again, I'd say the key point, and that's often forgotten by reformers on the left, is we need to make sure the sentence is going to be seen as just. We can't just release them into the community because we think it will be safe. We have to make sure the punitive equivalence is there. So criminals are getting their just desserts. The public is satisfied. And there's actual deterrence because the criminals don't want to be punished with the electronic prison sentence.
First things that comes to mind, maybe it's not a good comparison, but it's like during the pandemic, we had a lot of people that went to remote work, and then a lot of these companies are now making these people come back to the office because it's just not as productive or whatnot as what they would have thought. So then I'm thinking, instead of having remote workers, we have remote prisoners. Like, will we have a point where it's just like, well, like it wasn't as it just didn't quite work as we anticipated it. Then I would wonder, like, okay, so like you have some prisoner that's locked up, and then do you have to store their footage for, I don't know, 50 years? And then what about all of like the various constitutional rights? What if they're going to the bathroom? How do they, do they turn their camera off when they're in the bathroom, or when they're having, relations with their wife? Is that going to be on camera, or is that going to be off camera? But then if the camera's off too long, are you knocking down the door because you're like, well, what is this? What is Pedro and, Olivia doing or whatever? You know what I mean? Like, I just feel like it's easy to say, but I feel like the implementation is always kind of more challenging than the theoretical side of it.
Without a doubt, there are a lot of technical challenges in implementation, and I co-authored an article on this called Electronic Prison, A Just Path to Decarceration, where we look at some of those technical challenges, and we actually price out some of the options like body camera equipment and, storage costs. It would still be significantly cheaper than physical incarceration, I will say that. In terms of like some of these challenges of, okay, when would they have to have a camera on or off? You would always have a two-part system. One, there would be a location monitor bracelet attached to them, which cannot come off. Doesn't matter what they're doing, showering, anywhere. So you know where they are. And then you would have a separate camera that has to be on. And if there is ever a time where they have to turn it off, such as, say, they're showering, using the bathroom, you can make sure they're not moving anywhere because you still have the location monitor. And then they have to turn their camera back on. And you have complete control of the guidelines. You can tell them you must turn your camera on. Okay, you can have it off. You can control sort of every aspect of their life, just like you can in a regular prison. You need to come up with sort of guidelines about what an electronic prison regime would look like and when the monitoring officer would allow people to have their camera on or off. But those are all technical challenges that I think could be solved and should be solved if we're actually looking for a feasible way to decarcerate people and save money.
I think one of the things that we see now is where people talk about like, progressive kind of reformers. And I thought this is a quote from one of your articles. I thought that was interesting, which is basically you say that, quote, the fact that so many progressive reformers are comfortable imposing their decriminalization policies without regard to community views demonstrates a deeply troubling anti-democratic tendency. Ideology has swayed many progressive reformers to view most of the public as benighted sheep who must be led by more enlightened shepherds with a better understanding of what behavior should be considered criminal and what punishments, if any, should be imposed. Such a view is neither democratic nor American. End of your quote. But with, kind of the direction that the country is going into, do you think that we're seeing a lot of these failed policies, like you mentioned in the same article about California with the whole any shoplifting under $950 was essentially decriminalized, and just all kind of the unintended consequences of that, and maybe the deception marketing of the actual politicians that wanted to push this through? Are we kind of headed, returning the corner in the United States of America towards maybe a safer, America, so to speak, where we actually value like, hey, you shoplift $1,000, maybe you should actually do some time?
I would certainly hope so. And I think that the sort of mini crime surge we saw starting in 2020, that woke a lot of people up, and it caused a lot of people to realize that some of these very soft on crime policies were a mistake. Like even in California, the voters partially reversed like that lenience on shoplifting in 2024. They had a ballot measure that said, okay, if you shoplift multiple times, it's going to be a felony again. And that will definitely help with that situation in particular. And you also see, I think, progressive criminal justice reformers backing off or losing some prominence within the Democratic Party. Like you had, Joe Biden, he went to great lengths to say defunding the police is not, the position of the Democratic Party. And Nancy Pelosi echoed him. And I think a lot of progressives are having to realize that crime is a serious problem and it actually affects like marginalized communities the worst. So if you're thinking about these things in terms of like social or racial justice, if a disproportionate number of crime victims are racial minorities, going easier on crime, letting more crime occur, that's not going to help anyone. That's just going to make everything worse in society. So I do think there's been a bit of an improvement. I will say it's not as great as I would like to see, particularly in academia. There's still a lot of talk of prison abolition and how we need to, decriminalize basically everything and go very soft on crime. So I don't think there's been quite as much of a movement in the ideological thought sphere as I'd like. But I do think there is definitely more of a political, on the ground demand for some protective measures. Let's actually take crime seriously. Let's keep the community safe. And that's good to see. And I think we can build on that in a bipartisan manner to say, here are common sense reforms which can improve criminal justice system effectiveness, keep people safer, and justly punish offenders, and potentially even decarcerate some of them. And I think that can get bipartisan approval. I'd say one really sad thing about the progressive criminal justice reform movement is it sort of ended this bipartisan moment we were having in criminal justice reform in the 2010s, and even the First Step Act in like 2018 was passed under the first Trump administration. It was sort of an understanding back then that, okay, we can move toward common sense criminal justice reform as long as it's making everybody safer. We can work toward more rehabilitation options. That's all good. But then I think you had progressive radicals come in and say, no, we don't really care about any of this safety, any about this justice. We're just trying to maximize decarceration, get everyone out of the prisons. All policing is bad. All punishment is bad. That was wildly out of touch with the community. There was nothing democratic about that. And I do hope that we're seeing, at least politically, that side going away.
One of the thing I believe when it comes to law enforcement is always just kind of like optics. We have the whole broken window, which, the whole theory basically is fairly true. Like if people see less crime, less graffiti, whatnot, then they just generally think the neighborhood is safer, which creates safer neighborhoods. But then I look at like other there's municipalities that essentially use the police force as like a profit center. So it's like, okay, let's get a bunch of speeding tickets because we need to generate revenue. DUIs is really like a big thing that a lot of municipalities will focus on. So there's certain crimes that they just go really hard at, and especially like DUIs where they're fairly easy to prove, as you can document, especially with the actual breathalyzer and whatnot. Maybe these communities need to change the way that they actually go about their actual policing. You look at like Europe, where they have a lot of like these speed cameras and red light cameras. So the actual police aren't doing these low level offenses. Maybe they're spending their time actually chasing murderers and rapists instead of actually the person doing 38 and a 25, and maybe that's a better use of their time, and we can actually go after. It just seems like a lot of the resources, I would say, they're kind of misaligned.
Yeah, I think I'm with you 100% on that. There's often this false idea that if you just spend more on policing, okay, you're automatically going to improve clearance rates, it's going to improve crime. Well, no, it really depends. What do you spend it on? If you're spending it on, say, increased traffic enforcement or repainting your squad cars, that's not going to do anything. You really need to channel it in toward things like hiring more detectives, building up the infrastructure so you can solve crimes like increased CCTV cameras. Those are the sort of things that are really going to make a difference in terms of clearance rates. I would say that what's also really important is generating the political attention and will to make this happen. So we need to find a way to publicize how shocking the current failures are. Because let's say, the mayor of a city had to get up every year and very loudly proclaim at a conference, oh, by the way, we didn't catch 75% of the murderers this year, and we didn't catch 95% of the rapists, and we didn't catch 90% of the robbers. If you had to say that, I'd guarantee a lot of the citizens would be very upset, and they'd be asking, okay, how can we actually improve those rates? There'd be political demand and some accountability there. It's the fact that all of this gets swept under the rug generally. Nobody really knows or talks about that. I'd say that's one of the huge problems, because if we can just shine a light on it, people do care about this. People absolutely care about getting justice, getting safety for their communities. We just need to put pressure on the policymakers to put more resources into the right areas to achieve these goals. And that's what I think will actually make the system better.
But I was reading one of your co-authors' books. It was Professor Paul Robinson. I forget the exact title, but it was something about pirates and whatnot. But he had this chapter on prohibition, which I find prohibition to be a very fascinating time in U.S. history. And basically, I mean, not to overly simplify it, but a lot of the crime that we had, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s was all from prohibition, where basically it's like you're telling people like, hey, you can't drink alcohol. And so you essentially have the elites like, don't drink alcohol. The average person is like, how am I breaking a crime? I'm just drinking alcohol, which was legal last year. So now once you start breaking the prohibition laws, well, other laws that no longer are that taboo to break because you're already a criminal anyway. So it's kind of like, fuck it, let's break all of them. And then, of course, you get into the point where now all of a sudden you have these criminal syndicates. And so, like, you just end up with this whole other subset of society that, you know, like Al Capone was cool, right? Like Al Capone was the one supplying alcohol and all this stuff. So it's like now you're like criminals are cool. But the thing is, it's not like once you repeal prohibition that all of a sudden these syndicates are eliminated overnight. They just kind of shift, kind of extrapolating prohibition to now with all the progressive policies that we talked about. Are we like in a prohibition 2.0? Is this just an absolutely bad analogy? What would you say?
Yeah, I'd say the core of that analogy is correct because, and this is something that Paul Robinson has really devoted a lot of his career to study, is this concept of the moral credibility of the law. If people see the criminal law as morally credible, like an accurate guide to what's right and wrong, they think it's fairly enforced, there are just punishments, they're far more likely to obey the law and to cooperate with police investigations, turn criminals in, report crimes, all sorts of good things that reduce crime rates. But if anything happens that makes them think, okay, the law is actually not credible, it's punishing things that aren't crimes, like prohibiting alcohol, or it's not punishing things that are crimes, like letting shoplifters just clean out entire CVSs in California, all of that is going to reduce the moral credibility of the law. It's going to make people more likely to break the law, less likely to cooperate with police, less likely to internalize the norms that you want them to from the law. And that's a very real dynamic that's been shown in social psychology experiments, historical examples like prohibition. And I do think we're in a period where the moral credibility of the law is pretty low. And it's pretty low in both directions in terms of people see instances where crime is going unpunished that should be, like, say, in the shoplifting example, or even the fact that so many murderers and rapists are getting away with their crimes. And they're also seeing it sometimes in the over-criminalization direction, just like in prohibition. For example, the vast majority of Americans now, according to polls, support marijuana decriminalization. They think that it really isn't a matter for the criminal law. And while it's true that most, like pot smokers, as we discussed, are not being harshly punished, it is still technically a crime in a lot of states, and that's out of sync with public opinion. And that's an example where you have sort of a gateway crime as opposed to a gateway drug. It's like, okay, I'm doing marijuana. That's technically illegal. Okay, what other laws can I break? It's not that bad. So we really want to focus on making sure the criminal law and the criminal justice system reflects what the community believes is just and reflects what the community believes should be punished. And if the law gets out of sync with the community, it's definitely going to increase crime and reduce the effectiveness of the entire system. And that's what we saw during Prohibition. And I think that's what we've seen recently with some of the criminal justice issues that we're dealing with today.
The follow-up chapters to that, Paul Robinson had a chapter on Colombia and Pablo Escobar. So it's kind of like the opposite situation where you have the criminal. At the time, he was like the richest person in the world. He's on the Forbes, was it like 1983 richest person in the world, whatever. Yet the state, you know, Colombia, in order to actually curtail him, had to kind of violate a lot of civil liberties. In this situation, the average person was like, in Colombia, was like, I don't want to deal with this guy. Like, I don't want to get murdered because of this whole cocaine trade. We're kind of always on this teeter-totter where it's like you have to balance the rights of the criminals and balancing the rights of the actual victims. And how do you do that? And what do you have to say about the whole Pablo Escobar situation in the 1980s?
I would say, and this is not well appreciated by a lot of legal academics who focus very much on sort of correct criminal procedure, making sure you're honoring everybody's rights. The average person, whether it's in America, Colombia, or anywhere else, they care more about just results than process. Meaning, is the person like Pablo Escobar, who's a serious criminal, being punished? Is he behind bars or not? Or in the case of Prohibition, is this person who's just trying to get a drink of alcohol going to be criminalized or not? They care about those results, not quite as much as the process to which you got to those results. Process is important, but results are really the most important. And that's what I think explains that dichotomy of sometimes maybe you need to reduce the protections of criminal procedure if you're a place like Colombia and you've got a huge crime problem. A really great example of this actually is El Salvador recently, which of course is controversial But what's not controversial is that the crime rate has absolutely plunged. Like El Salvador used to be the most dangerous country in the Americas, perhaps the entire world. And today it's the safest country in the Americas. That's how much they cleaned up their homicide rate. And the way they did it was they basically arrested a bunch of potential criminals and they held them without trial for indefinite periods. And that was effective. Now, that was obviously a reduction in defendants' rights. And I'm not saying we should do that in the US, but that's an example where sometimes you have to bend procedure if you're going to get just results. And I do think in America, one thing we can learn is we should be a little less focused now, I'd say, on defendants' rights, given that there is such a huge problem of unpunished serious crime. Like if we had clearance rates of 90%, I can totally understand the focus of, all right, what can we do to make sure this is a little more fair to defendants? When you have a system where almost everybody is getting away for their crimes, I think the focus really needs to be on, okay, what can we do to make sure we're actually punishing more of this serious crime and preventing it, and not so much on what's the best way we can ensure that criminals have every chance to sort of escape punishment during the whole pretrial process.
So today's guest has been Jeffrey Seaman, who is a Levy Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, is also a researcher and writer there on the criminal justice system. We discussed his article today, Mass Incarceration, Myths and Facts. Jeffrey, there's two final questions. Just one, where can people find you? I know that you have a book that you co-wrote with Paul Robinson, another person. Where can they find that book? And then after that, leave us with a final thought.
Well, Confronting Failures of Justice, my book with Paul Robinson, you can find it on Amazon or other major booksellers. And I mean, you can follow my work on Google Scholar or those Penn Law Scholars. They have depositories of research articles that I write. In terms of a final thought, I would say, really, we need to focus the justice system on justice, because that's in the title. Everybody talks about, the criminal justice system. But really, there isn't a lot of focus on actually achieving justice as the community sees it. It's very disconnected from that mission right now. It's either pursuing these various ideological goals, or it's controlled by elite policymakers who aren't reflective of community opinion. But I think we just need to refocus it on justice. And if we do that, we're going to be moving in the right direction in terms of criminal justice reform.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.